The unyielding cry, an image rediscovered. The weight of sugar. Before we start, just a reminder, if you enjoy this kind of content, subscribe to the channel. Now, let's get to the video. The air hung heavy and sweet over La Esperanza, a sprawling sugar ingenio, nestled deep within the verdant, suffocating heart of Cuba in 220. But it was a sweetness born of bitterness, a luxury cultivated by the unyielding swing of the machete and the crushing weight of human despair. Here, life was measured in cane stalks, each one representing another drop of sweat, another lash, another sunrise that brought no hope of freedom. Mateo, his back a permanent landscape of scars, worked the fields under the relentless Caribbean sun. His skin, the color of rich earth, glistened with sweat, and his muscles, hardened by years of brutal labor, strained with every swing of the heavy blade. He was a man of quiet dignity. His eyes, often downcast, held a deep, simmering fire that few dared to meet. He had seen too much, endured too much, and in the depths of his being, a seed of rebellion had taken root, watered by the tears of his people. Beside him, Elara, younger and leaner, chapped with a fierce, almost desperate energy. Her hands, despite their calluses, still bore the faint traces of youthful softness, a memory of a life stolen. She had been brought to La Esperanza as a child, ripped from her village across the great sea, and had known nothing but the tyranny of the cane. But Elara possessed a spirit as wild and untamed as the jungle that bordered the plantation. Her gaze, when she thought no one was looking, often drifted towards the horizon, beyond the endless fields, towards a freedom she only dreamt of. The architect of their misery was Don Rafael Mendez, the overseer, a man whose cruelty was as boundless as the Cuban sky. Mendez was a caricature of colonial power, bloated, red-faced, and prone to outbursts of savage violence. He patrolled the fields on horseback, his whip a cruel extension of his will, its crack echoing, like a gunshot through the fields, a constant reminder of their bondage. His voice, when he used it, was a bark, a sneer, a torrent of abuse that stripped away dignity with every syllable. He lived for the sugar, for the profits it brought his absent master, Don Alejandro Vargas, a wealthy Havana planter who only visited La Esperanza twice a year, his delicate sensibilities unable to withstand the raw reality of his wealth. Life on La Esperanza was a brutal, monotonous cycle. Before dawn, the rising sun would reveal the shadowy figures trudging towards the fields, their bodies aching even before the day began. The trapiche, the sugar mill, was the heart of the monster, its massive rollers groaning day and night, transforming the bitter cane into sweet, golden crystals. The noise was incessant, a grinding, hissing symphony of exploitation. The air around it was thick with the sickly sweet smell of molasses and the acrid tang of burnt sugar, mingling with the stench of sweat, blood, and despair. Another day, another cane, a voice would sometimes whisper, a hollow joke among the weary workers. Sleep was a luxury, meals were meager, and the fear of Mendez's whip was a constant companion. Illness was common, death frequent, but the steady flow of new arrivals from the slave ships meant the ranks were always replenished, and the ingenio's insatiable hunger for labor never went unsatisfied. But beneath the forced submission, the embers of resistance glowed. In the slave quarters, hidden from Mendez's praying eyes, whispers began to circulate. Tales of upper signs in distant lands, of slaves seizing their freedom in Haiti, of revolts that had shattered the chains. Their stories, carried by new arrivals or passed on through hushed conversations, were dangerous sparks in the tinderbox of their despair. Mateo was often at the center of these clandestine gatherings. His calm demeanor belied a keen intellect and a strategic mind. He listened when he spoke, weighing the risks, understanding the desperation. He knew that a rebellion was a gamble, a desperate throw of the dice that could lead to mass slaughter. But he also knew that the remaining in bondage was a slow, agonizing death of the spirit. "We are strong," Mateo would say, his voice low, resonating with an unspoken power. "Stronger than they know. They fear us. That is why they bind us so tightly." Elara, too, became a fervent advocate for action. Her youthful fire, though tempered by the daily brutal realities, burned brightly. She yearned for freedom with an intensity that bordered on physical pain. "Better to die free than live another day in chains," she declared one night, her voice trembling with emotion, earning nods of agreement from the small group huddled in the darkness. The catalyst came in the sweltering heat of August. A young girl, barely 12 years old, was caught trying to steal a handful of raw sugar, driven by hunger. Mende, in a fit of rage, ordered her flogged in front of the entire slave population, an act of such casual brutality that it snapped something in the collective consciousness of the enslaved. Her screams, thin and desperate, pierced through the air, and for the first time Mateo saw defiance, not just despair, in the eyes of his fellow workers. Even Don Alejandro, visiting for his quarterly inspection, offered no protest, merely turning his head away from the sight, as if the brutality was a necessary, unpleasant aspect of his lucrative business. That night, the whispers turned into plans. The frustration, the humiliation, the sheer accumulated injustice boiled over. The brutal flogging of the child was not just an isolated incident, it was the final, unbearable straw. Mendez had overstepped, revealing the true face of their masters. Mateo, his face grim, addressed the gathering. "They treat us as less than animals, but we are men and women with hearts that beat for freedom. This land, it is watered with our blood, sweetened with our sweat. It is ours by right." He held up a crude, sharpened machete, its edge glinting faintly in the moonlight that filtered into their small hut. "Tomorrow, the can will not be the only thing we cut." A low murmur, a mixture of fear and fierce determination, rippled through the group. The plan was simple, born of desperation and the intimate knowledge of the ingenious layout. They would strike at the heart of the operation, the mill, under the cover of night. They would use the tools of their oppression, the machetes used for cutting cane, the torches used for lighting their path in the dark, as instruments of liberation. The dense smoke from the mill's chimneys, usually a sign of protectivity, would become their shroud, their cover. The air still hung heavy and sweet, but now it was also thick with a different scent, the scent of impending revolution. The weight of sugar, once a symbol of their bondage, was about to be transformed into the fuel of their uprising. The sun would rise again, but this time it would bear witness to a desperate, fiery struggle for the soul of La Esperanza. The appointed night arrived cloaked in a thick, humid darkness, pierced only by the distant gleam of stars and the constant, rhythmic groan of La Esperanza's trapiche. A restless tension wound through the slave quarters, a mixture of terror and a fierce, burning resolve. This was the moment. There would be no turning back. Mateo moved with a quiet purpose, his hands checking the familiar weight of his machete, honed to a razor's edge from years of cutting cane, now repurposed for a different harvest. He looked at Elara, her face grim but resolute, holding a flaming torch high. Around them, other figures emerged from the shadows, their eyes alight with a shared desperate courage. Some clutched machetes, others held crude bludgeons, and a few carried simple axes, salvaged or secretly forged. Their numbers were perhaps 100 strong, a fraction of the ingenious enslaved population, but they were the brave, the desperate, the ones who had finally decided that death was preferably to another day in chains. "Remember the plan," Mateo whispered, his voice barely audibly above the chirping of crickets and the distant mill. "The mill first, then the overseer's house. No mercy for the cruel." The path to the trapiche was well trodden, a route they had walked countless times, under the brutal gaze of their masters. But tonight, it felt different. Each step was heavy with destiny, reverberating with the silent echoes of generations of suffering. The Caribbean palms, swaying gently in the night breeze, seemed to whisper encouragement, their fronds like ancient, knowing spirits. The can huts, dark and silent, bore witness to their desperate exodus. As they approached the meal, the immense structure loomed before them, its chimneys belching dense smoke into the night sky, a stark black plume against the starlight. The air grew thick with the cloying sweetness of molasses and the acrid bite of burnt sugar. The relentless grinding of the rollers, the hiss of steam, and the shouts of the few night guards made it an industrial beast, seemingly impervious to human defiance. Now, Mateo bellowed, his voice raw, cutting through the din. With a unified guttural cry they surged forward. The first torches, thrown with practiced aim, landed on the dry stacks of bagasse, the fibrous residue of crushed cane, piled high around the mill. Flames erupted instantly, licking greedily at the dry material, sending tongues of fire leaping towards the sky. The dense smoke, previously a symbol of brutality, now became their ally, swirling, choking, and blinding. The few colonial soldiers and overseer guards on duty at the mill were caught completely off guard. They were accustomed to the quiet subservience of the slaves, to the rhythmic sounds of labor, not to the terrifying roar of rebellion. Panic flared in their eyes as the shadows erupted into a chaotic, screaming mass of human bodies, armed with the very tools of the plantation. Rebeldes, fuego, alarma! One guard shrieked, his voice swallowed by the rising cacophony. Mateo, fooled by years of pent-up rage, swung his machete with brutal efficiency. The first soldier to meet him fell, a choked gasp escaping his lips. The sharp blade cut through the air, finding flesh, leaving a trail of blood on the dusty ground. Elara, her torch held high, moved like a phantom, her eyes fixed on the entrance to the mill, where the great rollers groaned. She saw a guard fumbling with his rifle, his face pale with fear. Without hesitation, she swung her torch, the flames leaking at his face, momentarily disorienting him, allowing another rebel to bring him down. The scene inside the mill was pure pandemonium. The grinding machinery continued its work for a few agonizing moments, oblivious to the human struggle, before the rebels, with axe and machete, began to hack at the critical gears and levers. Sparks flew, metals screamed against metal, and with a series of grinding groans, the massive rollers shuddered to a halt. The monstrous heart of La Esperanza ceased to beat. A triumphant roar erupted from the rebels, a primal cry of defiance, but the fight was far from over. More soldiers, roused by the alarms and the rising smoke, began to converge on the mill from the main house and barracks. Their muskets cracked, spitting fire into the darkness, sending splinters of wood and chunks of stone flying. The rebels, though courageous, were ill-equipped against trained soldiers and firearms. Several fell, their cries of pain quickly silenced. "Hold the line, protect the mill," Mateo roared, rallying his people. The mill was not just a target, it was a symbol, a beacon. Its destruction was their declaration of war. Elara saw Don Rafael Mendez, the overseer, emerging from the shadows near the barracks, his face contorted in a mask of apoplectic rage. He barked orders at his soldiers, urging them to fire, to cut down the animals. His whip, forgotten for a moment, hung mercilessly at his side. He was still the master, but his world was crumbling around him. Mendez. Elara screamed, a raw, powerful sound that resonated through the smoke. She pointed her torch at him, its flame illuminating her face, transforming her into a furious, avenging angel. Mendez, recognizing her snare, "You insolent bitch! I'll have your hide for this." He raised his pistol, aiming at her, but before he could fire, a group of rebels, led by a burly field hand named Cojo, surged forward, their machetes glinting. Mendez's shot went wide as Cojo brought his blade down, a swift, decisive strike that silenced the overseer's cruel voice forever. A cheer erupted from the rebels, a small victory, but one that tasted sweeter than any sugar. The mill, engulfed in flames, became a roaring inferno. The denser smoke mixed with the acrid smell of burning sugar and flesh, billowed higher, obscuring the moon, painting the sky in shades of black and angry orange. The Caribbean palms, previously silent observers, now danced wildly in the flickering light, their shadows stretching like grasping claws. The cane huts, though untouched by the immediate fire, stood witness to the chaos, their fragile walls trembling with the vibrations of the battle. The scene was a maelstrom of sound and fury. The crack of muskets, the clang of machetes against steel, the shouts of men, the desperate screams of the wounded. It was the raw, unadulterated reality of a slave rebellion, brutal, terrifying, and utterly desperate. For a brief, intoxicating moment, the enslaved were no longer ghost laborers. They were warriors, fighting for their very souls, illuminated by the vengeful fire of La Esperanza. The forbidden image of their uprising was being seared into the fabric of history, a truth that no amount of colonial suppression could ever truly erase. The initial surge of the rebellion at La Esperanza was a terrifying, exhilarating success, shattering the illusion of impenetrable colonial control. The Trapiche, now a blazing pyre, roared its defiance into the night, its smoke rising like a dark, vengeful spirit. But as the sun, a palais hesitant de sex, began to peek over the eastern horizon, painting the thick smoke in sickly shades of orange and gray, the tide of the battle began to turn. Don Alejandro Vargas, the absentee owner, had been roused from his comfortable bed in the main house by the inferno at his mill and the cacophony of battle. His initial shock turned to cold, calculating fury. He was a man of power, accustomed to order, and this rebellion was an affront to his authority, a direct attack on his wealth. He dispatched riders immediately to the nearest garrison in Matanzas, demanding swift and brutal retribution. The rebels, high on their initial victory, now faced organized resistance. The remaining colonial soldiers, reinforced by the estate's armed foremen and a few terrified loyalists, regrouped under the command of Sergeant Miguel Ramirez, a seasoned veteran with a reputation for ruthlessness. Ramirez understood the psychology of these uprisings. They were fueled by desperation and lacked formal training. His strategy was simply contain, disorganize, and overwhelm. Form on, fire by volleys. Ramirez bellowed, his voice cutting through the remaining chaos. So these savages the cost of insolence. Muskets cracked with disciplined regularity, sending volleys of lead tearing through the rebel ranks. The enslaved, armed primarily with agricultural tools, found themselves outmatched against firearms. Their courage was boundless, but their bodies were vulnerable. Men and women fell, their desperate cries silenced by the unforgiving bullets. Mateo, his face streaked with soot and sweat, fought with the ferocity of a cornered lion. He dodged the bayonet thrust, bringing his machete down with a powerful arc, disabling his attacker. He rallied his people, pushing them forward, trying to break the disciplined line of soldiers. "Hold your ground. Don't let them break us," he roared, his voice hoarse. Elara, clutching a blood-stained machete, fought by his side. She saw the desperation in the eyes of her comrades, the mounting casualties. The initial surge of adrenaline was giving way to exhaustion and the grim realization of the odds stacked against him. The fire from the mill cast a monstrous, dancing shadows on the walls of the nearby barracones, illuminating the horrific tableau. The battle spread. Some rebels, desperate to inflict further damage, attempted to set fire to the cane fields, hoping to deprive their masters of the very source of their wealth. Flames leaked at the dry cane, sending more smoke billowing into the already choked air. But the soldiers, anticipating this, were quick to put out the fires, aided by the slave drivers who knew the terrain. The struggle was particularly fierce around the main sugar refining buildings. The rebels aimed to destroy the vats of molasses, the stored sugar, anything that represented their bondage. They were met with determined resistance from soldiers defending the valuable produce. The sounds of clanging metal, shouting in desperate hand-to-hand combat, echoed from within the stone walls. Cojo, the burly field hand who had dispatched Mendez, led a group into one of the refining sheds, his eyes burning with vengeful fire. They smashed barrels, overturned equipment, creating a sticky, sweet chaos, but they were eventually driven back by musket fire, leaving several of their number behind. Hours bled into a brutal stalemate. The rebels, though outnumbered and outgunned, fought with a desperate ferocity, born of their yearning for freedom. They hurled rocks, charged directly into musket fire, and used their intimate knowledge of the plantation grounds to execute flanking maneuvers. But the soldiers, with their superior weapons and training, slowly but surely gained the upper hand. Mateo watched in grim silence as more of his people fell. Their initial triumph was dissolving into a bloody, desperate fight for survival. The sun was fully risen now, revealing the carnage in stark, merciless detail. Bodies lay scattered across the fields and around the smoldering ruins of the mill. The ground was stained with blood, and the air was thick with the smell of death, burnt sugar, and human despair. By mid-morning, the sound of hoofbeats thundered in the distance, growing louder with terrifying speed. Don Alejandro's riders had returned, not alone, but with a full company of Spanish dragoons from Matanzas. Their polished uniforms, their gleaming sabers, and the sight of their mounted, disciplined formation struck a cold dread into the hearts of the rebels. These were not mere plantation guards. These were professional soldiers, armed for war. Reinforcements, a soldier yelled, a triumphant roar in his voice. Despair flickered in the eyes of many rebels. The odds, already insurmountable, had just multiplied. Mateo saw the look on Elara's face, a mixture of defiance and agonizing realization. "We cannot fight, Mateo," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "They are too many, too strong." Mateo clenched his jaw. He had promised them freedom, and now he looked at the approaching dragoons, their numbers seemingly endless, their mission clear, utter annihilation. To continue fighting was suicide. To surrender was a return to an even more brutal bondage, followed by inevitable execution. "To the monte!" Mateo roared, his voice cutting through the din of battle. "Scatter! Run! Those who can, run for the mountains!" The order, though born of defeat, was also a desperate plea for survival. The remaining rebels, battered and weary, broke ranks. Some continued to fight, a futile, last stand against overwhelming force. Others, seizing the chance, turned and fled, disappearing into the dense, tangled jungle that bordered the sugar estate. Their only hope, the unforgiving embrace of the wilderness. Elara hesitated for a moment, looking at the burning mill, at the fallen bodies of her comrades, at the faces of the approaching soldiers. Then she looked at Mateo. He nodded, a silent command in his eyes. "Go, Elara," he urged, pushing her towards the trailing. "Live, remember us." She ran, a desperate, sobbing gasp tearing from her throat. The roar of the battle faded behind her, replaced by the pounding of her own feet and the rustling of leaves. The smoke from La Esperanza continued to rise, but now it was a mournful shroud, covering not the triumph of rebellion, but the grim, bloody dawn of its suppression. The dream of freedom, born in fire, was now a desperate flight into the unknown.
The monte, the dense, untamed beauty that bordered the Esperanza, offered a deceptive sanctuary. Its thick canopy blocked out the harsh sun, creating a cool, humid gloom. The air, heavy with the scent of damp earth and unseen blossoms, hummed with the buzzing of insects and the rustling of unseen creatures. But for Mateo and the handful of surviving rebels who had fled into its depths, the monte was less a refuge and more a labyrinth of dangers. Mateo moved with an instinct of a hunted animal, his senses heightened, every rustle, every snap of a twig, a potential threat. He had led perhaps 30 people into the wilderness, a desperate, silent exodus from the blood-soaked fields of La Esperanza. Among them Yoselara, her face grim, her youthful energy replaced by a weary determination. Cojo, the giant field hand, his machete still clutched in his hand, moved like a shadow through the undergrowth, his eyes scanning for danger. The Spanish dragoons, under the command of Captain Eduardo Ramirez, Sergeant Miguel's brother, and even more zealous enforcer of colonial law, launched a relentless hunt. These were seasoned trackers, accustomed to pursuing runaways, and they followed the rebels' trail with chilling efficiency. Their horses, though hampered by the dense foliage, provided speed and a terrifying presence, their hooves thundering even through the thickest undergrowth. Spread out, find them, leave no stone unturned. Captain Ramirez barked, his voice filled with cold fury. These animals will learn that freedom is an illusion. Survival in the monte was a brutal teacher. Food was scarce, and what was edible was often difficult to identify. They gnawed on wild roots, foraged for unfamiliar fruits, and drank from murky streams, risking disease. The constant humidity, combined with the lack of proper shelter, led to chills and fevers. Their tattered clothes, already stained with the grime of the sugar mill, became torn and muddy, offering little protection from the biting insects and thorny vines. "We must find water," Elara whispered to Mateo one night, her voice hoarse, her lips cracked. "And we need to rest. Some of us are falling behind." Mateo nodded, his own body aching with fatigue. He knew the risks of resting. Every minute they stopped was a minute gained by their pursuers, but they also knew that exhaustion would make them careless, vulnerable. He chose a small, secluded clearing, hidden by a natural rock overhang, for a brief, uneasy respite. The fear of capture was a constant, gnawing presence. They moved primarily at night, their figures merging with the deep shadows of the jungle. They learned to erase their tracks, to move silently, to listen for the telltale sounds of pursuit, the crack of a distant musket, the baying of the bloodhounds the soldiers sometimes used. The monte was their cover, but it was also a hostile environment, a test of their endurance. One morning the distant bark of dogs sent a jolt of terror through the group. "Bloodhounds," Cojo hissed, his eyes wide. "They're close." Mateo reacted swiftly. "Scatter. Meet at the Great Ceiba Tree, west of the old riverbed. Move." The Ceiba Tree was a towering landmark, a sacred symbol of resilience, and a prearranged emergency rendezvous point they had whispered about in the slave quarters. The group dispersed, fleeing in different directions, hoping to confuse their pursuers. Mateo, Elara, and Cojo stayed together, moving deeper into the densest parts of the jungle, their machetes clearing paths where none existed. They heard the shouts of the soldiers, the excited barks of the dogs, growing closer, then receding as the trackers were led astray by false trails. Hours later, battered and breathless, they reached the colossal Ceiba tree, its roots like buttresses supporting a vast, ancient trunk. Slowly other survivors began to trickle in, their faces pale, their bodies trembling. Only half of the original 30 had made it. The jungle and the hunt had claimed the rest. "We cannot stay together," Mateo announced,
his voice grim. "They will track a large group too easily. We must split into smaller bands. Perhaps then some of us can reach the mountains, the Palenques." The Palenques were the legendary hidden settlements of escaped slaves, deep in the inaccessible mountains, places where freedom fighters lived beyond the reach of colonial law. "And are more myth than reality for most," whispered about in hushed tones. But now they were their only hope. The decision was painful, a further fracture of their already shattered rebellion. But it was a pragmatic choice for survival. They divided into groups of 5 or 6, each with a designated leader and a general direction. They shared their meager supplies, offered words of encouragement, and then, under the cover of the approaching dusk, they melted back into the shadows of the monte, each group a tiny flicker of hope against the overwhelming darkness. Mateo, Elara, and Cojo formed one such group, heading further west, towards the distant, hazy peaks of the Sierra Maestra. Their journey was a continuous struggle against exhaustion, hunger, and the constant fear of discovery. They learned to identify the edible plants, to set snares for small game, to interpret the signs of the jungle. They became cimarrones, wild and free, but living a precarious existence on the run. One night, as they huddled beneath a thicket of palms, a torrential downpour turned the monte into a muddy, impassable swamp. The rain, a welcome relief from the heat, also washed away their tracks, momentarily frustrating their pursuers. But it also brought its own miseries, chilling cold, disease, and the constant, disheartening damp. Despite the hardships, a fierce sense of solidarity bound them together. They were no longer just Mateo, Elara, and Cojo. They were the last vestiges of a desperate uprising, the living memory of La Esperanza's rebellion. Each sunrise, each successful evasion of the soldiers, was a small victory, a defiant assertion of their right to breathe free. The monte had become their home, their protector, and their tormentor. It was a brutal crucible that stripped away all but the most essential human qualities: resilience, resourcefulness, and the unyielding will to survive. The hunt continued, relentless and unforgiving, but deep within the labyrinthine embrace of the Cuban wilderness, a flickering flame of resistance, born from the ashes of La Esperanza, still stubbornly burned. The suppression of the La Esperanza rebellion was swift and brutal. Captain Ramirez, with his contingent of dragoons and the loyalist forces from the Ingenio, swept through the plantation and the surrounding cane fields, capturing those who had not managed to escape into the monte. The display of colonial might was absolute, designed to instill terror and crush any future thoughts of defiance. Those captured were publicly flogged, often to death, or summarily executed. Their bodies were left exposed as a gruesome warning, a stark reminder of the consequences of rebellion. The barracones were searched, any suspected rebel sympathizers identified and punished. The Ingenio, still smoking from the ruins of the Trapiche, was swiftly put back into operation. New, cheaper slaves acquired to replace the lost labor, and a new, even more ruthless overseer brought in. The message was clear: life would resume, and the chains would be tighter than ever. Don Alejandro Vargas, after assessing the damage, commissioned a detailed report for the colonial government, downplaying the scale of the uprising, emphasizing the swiftness of its suppression, and portraying the rebels as a handful of deluded, violent savages. He ensured that the incident was recorded in official documents as a minor disturbance, swiftly quelled, rather than a full-blown rebellion that had threatened the very foundations of his wealth and the colonial order. Any mention of the burning mill, the death of Mendez, or the desperate flight into the monte was either omitted or heavily sanitized. The colonial authorities, eager to maintain the image of absolute control and prevent similar uprisings, readily adopted Vargas's narrative, or they were issued to censor any public discussion of the event. Newspapers were warned against publishing details. Any existing records were sealed, hidden away in obscure government archives. The aim was to erase the rebellion from public memory, to ensure that no spark of hope or inspiration could be drawn from La Esperanza's defiance. The image of slaves rising with machetes and torches was forbidden, a truth too dangerous to be acknowledged. Mood memory, particularly the memory of suffering and defiance, is a stubborn thing. Though publicly silenced, the story of La Esperanza, of Mateo and de Lara and Coco, of the brave who had dared to strike for freedom, did not die. It lived on in whispers, passed from one slave to another in the darkness of the barracones, in the can fields, a legend growing with each retelling. The burning mill became a symbol, not of defeat, but of a burning spirit that could never truly be extinguished. They say Mateo vanished into the monte. A grandmother would murmur to her grandchildren, her eyes gleaming in the dim light of the hut. He walks among the trees now, a spirit of freedom, waiting for the right moment to return. And Elara, another would add, she was a fire. Her spirit burns in the heart of every woman who longs to be free. The Ingenio itself bore the scars of the rebellion. The newly rebuilt Trapiche, though functional, never quite recaptured its previous efficiency. The air, once merely sweet, now carried a faint, lingering scent of ash and blood, a ghost of the fire that had raged within its heart. The rebuilt walls were stronger, but the fear of another uprising, however suppressed, was a palpably undercurrent that permeated every aspect of life on La Esperanza. Meanwhile, Mateo, Elara, and Cojo, along with their small band, continued their arduous journey into the Sierra Maestra. The mountains were a harsh mistress, but they offered true sanctuary. After weeks of relentless trekking, they stumbled upon a small established palenque, a community of escaped slaves who had built a precarious but free existence away from colonial rule. Their arrival was met with suspicion, then cautious welcome. They were survivors, living proof that the spirit of resistance endured. Mateo recounted the tale of La Esperanza, the desperate battle, the burning mill, the tragic losses. His words, filled with a raw, undeniable truth, resonated deeply within the palenque. He spoke of the horror, but also of the courage, the shared defiance. The elder of the palenque, a woman named Mama Ode, listened intently. "You bring the fire, son," she said, her voice ancient and wise. "The fire of knowledge, the fire of pain, but also the fire of hope." Mateo and his companions found a new purpose within the palenque. They became teachers, sharing their experiences, helping to train new runaways, imparting lessons learned from their desperate uprising. They knew that complete freedom for all might still be a distant dream, but within the hidden folds of the mountains, they had carved out a space where they could live as free men and women. Yet, the memory of La Esperanza never truly faded. Mateo often reflected on the raw, desperate power of that night, the sight of his people, armed with their crude tools, rising against their oppressors. He wished, more than anything, that the world could see what he had seen, that the courage of his comrades would not be lost to the deliberate amnesia of official history. Unknown to him, a faint, grainy echo of that night did exist. A foreign abolitionist, a quiet observer who had once visited La Esperanza under the guise of an agricultural expert, had secretly captured a single ill-seated image of the rebellion's chaotic peak. He had been a silent witness, hidden among the nearby cane fields, his camera a new, fragile technology capable of freezing moments in time. He had developed a challenging secret, knowing its explosive power, and had carefully hidden it away, smuggling it out of Cuba, a forbidden truth, a historical archive too dangerous to be revealed in its time. Its edges were slightly damaged, its texture grainy, and it bore the faint marks of time, reflecting its clandestine journey through decades. It was a testament to the fact that even in an era of suppression and erasure, some truths, however fragile, find a way to endure, awaiting the moment when they can finally emerge from the shadows and shock the world. The year Cuba, a republic now, though still grappling with its past, vibrated with the rhythms of modernity. Havana, a glittering jewel, embraced jazz and American influence while the sugar industry continued its relentless hum, a ghost of its old self. Yet, beneath the veneer of progress, the echoes of slavery, of suppressed rebellions, and forgotten cruelties still resonated, largely unacknowledged. Professor Elias Thorne, a meticulous historian from a small specialized archive in New York, found himself drawn to these forgotten narratives. It was a quiet, unassuming man, obsessed with unearthing the uncomfortable truths buried beneath official histories. His current project was researching the lesser-known slave uprisings in the Caribbean during the early 19th century, events often dismissed as mere disturbances in colonial records. His searches led him to a dusty, uncatalogued collection of papers bequeathed to the archive by a deceased descendant of a minor British abolitionist. It was a jumbled assortment of letters, pamphlets, and personal effects, seemingly unremarkable. Thorne spent weeks sifting through them, his patience an endless well. Then, tucked away in a false bottom of an old wooden box, wrapped in oilcloth and brittle parchment, he found a single photographic plate, crudely developed, its surface marred by minor scratches and smudges, its edges slightly chipped. It was a negative, but even holding it up to the light, he could discern the faint, ghostly outlines of a scene. The material was thick, heavy, unlike modern photographic plates. It bore the unmistakable signs of extreme age, a grainy texture, darkened corners, and an almost ethereal quality that whispered of secrets kept for a century. Thor, his heart pounding, carefully took it to his darkroom. He had specialized equipment for preserving and digitizing ancient photographic materials. The process was slow, painstaking, fraught with the risk of damaging the fragile relic. But as the image slowly began to materialize on the photographic paper, a gasp escaped his lips. It was a black and white photograph, its texture raw and gritty, as if the very despair of the moment had been etched onto the emulsion. The edges were indeed damaged, a testament to its clandestine journey through time. And faint, almost unnoticeable marks spoke of a hurried development or a desperate attempt to conceal it. The scene it depicted was one of unimaginable chaos and raw power. In the foreground, a group of enslaved people, their faces a blur of grim determination and desperate fury, charged forward. They were armed with the instruments of their servitude that turned into weapons, long, gleaming machetes, held high, reflecting the flickering light. Others brandished torches, their flames licking at the dark air, illuminating the terror in their eyes. In the midground, dimly visible through the swirling smoke, colonial soldiers, their uniforms a stark contrast to the dark skin of the rebels, attempted to form a defensive line. Their posture suggested surprise, disarray. They fumbled with their muskets, some already engaged in desperate hand-to-hand combat, their bayonets clashing against the rebels' crude blade. The setting was unmistakable, a sugar mill, its massive, skeletal structures looming in the background, partially obscured by the dense, billowing smoke that seemed to emanate from the very ground, a testament to the destruction unfolding. Beyond the immediate conflict, the characteristic fronds of Caribbean palms swayed against a tumultuous sky, their silhouettes dark and brooding. Further back, the faint, humbly outlines of Can Hots stood witness to the unfolding tragedy, their fragile walls seemingly trembling in the dramatic atmosphere. The entire image pulsed with an undeniable energy, a raw, visceral intensity that transcended the century of its concealment. Thorne felt a profound sense of awe and sorrow. This was no mere disturbancy. This was a full-blown rebellion, a desperate cry for freedom, captured in a single, timeless frame. It was a truth that had been suppressed, censored, deliberately forgotten by the powers that be. The image screamed of a forbidden history, a testament to courage that official records had sought to bury, He spent days studying the print, analyzing its detail, the specific type of sugar mill architecture, the uniforms of the soldiers, the distinct features of the Caribbean landscape, all pointed to Cuba. This was the La Esperanza Rebellion, not as a sanitized report, but as it truly happened, a moment of raw, revolutionary violence, frozen in time. The very act of this photo existing, given the technology of the time and the context of a brutal crackdown, was a miracle. It was, Thorne realizes, a single, illicit snapshot taken by someone who had defied the powerful forces of historical erasure. The challenges of authenticating and presenting such a document were immense. It was an anomaly, a singular piece of evidence against a mountain of official silence. He knew it would face skepticism, resistance, perhaps even accusations of forgery, from those who preferred the conformable, untroubled version of history. But Thorne also understood its immense power. This was not just a picture, it was a voice of the oppressed, screaming defiance from the heart of an 19th century slave reprising. It was the visual proof that the spirit of freedom, even when crossed, burned brightly enough to be captured, however briefly, by the nascent eye of a camera. He prepared his findings meticulously, accompanying the photographic print with detailed historical context, comparing it with the scarce oblique references he had found in other, less censored abolitionist papers. His paper, The Unyielding Cry, a rediscovered image of the 120 pages 120, La Esperanza Rebellion, shook the quiet academic circles. Initial skepticism slowly gave way to grudging acceptance, then to profound re-evaluation. The image once forbidden now circulated. It appeared in academic journals, then in books, then in exhibitions. It wasn't just a historical artifact. It was a symbol. It told the story of countless untold rebellions, of anonymous heroes and martyrs whose struggles had been deliberately erased. It forced the world to confront a darker, more complex truth about the past, a truth that had been deliberately hidden for a century. The grainy texture, the damaged edges, the marks of time, they only added to its authenticity, its raw power. They were not imperfections, but badges of honor, testamented to its resilience. The 1820 image of a slave rebellion in Cuba that shocked the world became an iconic representation of human dignity against tyranny. And though the names of Mateo, Elara, and Cojo remained unwritten in official history, their spirit, their bravery, and their desperate cry for freedom found a silent, powerful voice in that single profound photograph. The century of censorship had ended, and the truth, in all its raw, shocking glory, had finally emerged from the shadows, an unyielding cry preserved in a grain of truth.